Victories are determined by strategic victories and the achievement of strategic goals. You can win tactical victories indefinitely. This is a local situation that does not give you the right to dictate conditions on the international stage, or say, to build up your potential at the strategic level. That is why Russia is actually trying to hold on to Ukraine. This aggression of Russian troops, the continuous intensity of attacks, is in fact Putin's attempt to find a way out of the situation. As soon as the intensity of the Russian troops decreases or they try to attack, it will automatically cause a fierce backlash within Russia. Internal contradictions will arise, and they are well aware of this. The question immediately arises. If Russia is not even achieving success at the local level, is the Russian command correct? The Russian Tsar, let's call him whatever we want, President, His Majesty, or whatever you call him among yourselves, it doesn't matter. In fact, he is becoming weak. In dictatorial countries, when the dictator is weak, he must be destroyed, eaten, in order to put a new one in his place. This Putin is broken, period. Therefore, he will never allow this to happen, no matter what the Russian society says. This Putin is broken. Let's have another one. As for the readiness of European countries, each country is different. Some are trying to really sincerely and maximally assist Ukraine. Others are trying to do so because of their post-Soviet ties with Putin, like Orban, who sincerely believes in his wet fantasies about Putin and Ukraine. Orban imagines that they will be able to reach an agreement with Putin in the future. However, as we know, Fico is a lot of rhetoric, but in fact, Slovakia has increased arms exports to Ukraine. Everyone knows and talks about it. But publicly he says no, no, no. In other words, he is trying to sit on two stools. And for Orban, Ursula von der Leyen said it best the other day when she noted that you have joined those who blame Ukrainians for the war. I mean, who blames Hungary when the Soviets invaded your country? I would put it differently. People like Orban should look at the history of the Ukrainian Western Ukrainian Communist Party. When the Bolsheviks came to Western Ukraine, they were the first to shoot non-Ukrainians. They first dismantled the Ukrainian Communist Party in Western Ukraine, as its members openly supported separatism. This set a precedent for targeting other communist parties, as they believed no other parties should exist. Putin envisions a world where countries like Hungary and the Baltic States don't exist independently. They should be part of a larger Russian Federation. He justifies this by citing historical ties, similar to how Russia entered Syria under the pretext of protecting Orthodox Syrians. They claim ethnic connections, noting that Hungarians descend from Ugrophin tribes once in modern Russia. So I think this will not be a problem for Putin at all. I give vivid examples to show Putin's perception of Europe as a whole. He doesn't see them as separate states. He sees them as one big Russian Federation. And he has to restore the white glory of Stalin, believing that Stalin was relatively mild-mannered because he killed maybe 10% of the population and occupied only a part of Europe. This is the truth. In Ukraine, they hope to send the bulk of Ukrainians to the front. There was a calculation. On February 22nd, they hoped that they would enter Kyiv, change the government, and destroy a part of the population that would be anti-Russian or pro-Kremlin. They obviously hoped that they would be able to establish cooperation with the Ukrainian High Command in order to integrate our armed forces into theirs. Can you imagine how many trained people, ready to fight and resentful of Europe for not helping, Russia could have gotten? It could be several million. Of course, he had such plans. He does not need Ukrainians who do not need Russians. He needs the territory and population to realize his ambitious plans. Putin thinks like this. Why invest in democracy, raise the economic potential of the Russian population, increase their intelligence, and fight for their minds to show that Russia is better and more developed than European countries? After all, it is much easier to deceive the Russian population, send them to war, invade rich, prosperous European countries, and exploit their populations. History has had numerous precedents. For example, the banal story of the Mongol invasion of Europe. I think Putin has read about Genghis Khan, when the Mongols occupied China, and essentially Chinese officials were put in charge of the Chinese. Their experience, both in technology and in other aspects, was adopted. It's roughly the same story that's happening now. Unfortunately, for some reason, most Europeans as well as Ukrainians do not understand the realities, threats, and challenges. I hope that someone else will realize that it is impossible to negotiate with Putin. You can only get some kind of pause with him if he thinks he is unable to capture you. However, he has a goal. Given that he is getting older every year, even if he is looking for the elixir of youth, he needs to look for the basic elixir. It's like piling up earth by the bedside to get used to the grave. He will still try to seize large territories to go down in history as one of the many collectors of Russian lands. History shows Russia that it doesn't matter how respectful you were to Russians, what kind of administrative or political system you have in a state, whether it's a monarchy, a parliamentary system, or an absolute dictatorship. The one who has shed the most blood in Russia is always considered the collector of Russian lands. The one who can boast of the bloodiest wars in Russian history is remembered through the ages and revered as godlike. So icons of Peter the Great, Nicholas the Bloody, Stalin, and now Putin in Russian churches can stand next to the face of Jesus. By the way, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned 1.5 million Ukrainians, whom, in case of defeat, the Russians could use to join the ranks of the occupation army and carry out their aggressive actions. However, we know that the Russians are already implementing such tactics.
Ви на початку, до речі, розмови сказали про те, що є 1,5 мільйона.
However, in an exchange with North Korea, South Korea wrote that North Korean troops could take part in Russia's war against Ukraine.
Свої подальші загарбницькі дії. Але знаємо, що окрім цього, росіяни вже впроваджують таку тактику, правда, по обміну з Північною Кореєю.
In this case, the opinions of researchers and military observers were somewhat divided.
Росії проти України думки дослідників і військових оглядачів дещо поділилися.
The IWI analysts wrote that these could be engineer troops that will be involved in the restoration of the Pentagon, in particular, the Donetsk region. Again, South Korea believes that North Korean troops could become cannon fodder. Which opinion do you favor? And in general, how critical is the situation with Russian personnel if they have to turn to the DPRK? So, here we should not consider the DPRK through the prism of our perception, but the Russians through the prism of the North Korean dictator. Despite all those shows of eternal prosperity, love, and kisses, he is well aware of the level and condition of the North Korean population, its general level of awareness, capabilities, state of armaments, and many other things. Yes, they can play internal games, but in the foreign policy arena, or even in a war with South Korea, he realizes that he cannot win at this stage. That is why he does not start a war. The North Korean weapons that ended up in the Russian army have shown to be of poor efficiency and low quality. We can talk a lot about the scale. For the Russian army, which has 140 million people, this is not very significant. Yes, except for the fact that there are also Russian weapons that are technically better than North Korean ones. That is, combining this with Iranian weapons, Russia can fight. The North Korean dictator understands that if he has to rely on his low-tech weapons, the chances of a war with South Korea, which is not only ready for war with the North, but also supplied Ukraine with 155mm shells, will be very low. They have nationally produced weapons, and if they are provided with any auxiliary reinforcement, it will be much more effective than North Korean weapons. The quality of his weapons and the quality of his troops cannot be trained by the dictator in North Korea. Of course, in the war, most of his generals who were decorated with orders received them for combat merit, which is not there. The North Korean dictator realizes that any army that has not been tested in serious combat operations is in fact a parade army. In addition, North Korea has only about 25 to 29 million people. It may be up to 30 million, but it's definitely not 140. That is, it has a much smaller internal resource. On the other hand, it can mobilize almost the entire population because North Korea is not an industrialized country. The entire population goes through the army, and service in the army lasts for many years. Theoretically or hypothetically, he could engage more than half of the population in combat, but he may run out of reserves. To prepare the North Korean army for combat, it is worth remembering that the dictator is well aware that if Putin loses, they will be left alone. A losing Putin is a threat. And where is the guarantee that South Korea will not want to unite completely? The question is whether China will not want to absorb North Korea and make it just a province, so as not to have another rebel territory. China has full influence on the processes in North Korea, and it also needs to be trained. But a really trained army. So I understand that he is looking at the Russian army, and the first specialists or experts that appear in the Russian army are the ground for, unfortunately, attracting more North Korean military. The dictator doesn't care. He needs to train not so much soldiers as commanders who will be able to properly and effectively manage those masses and conduct military operations. That is, commanders who are trained to fight in real war conditions. For them, even putting a 5 million strong army into action is difficult. But they don't need social guarantees like we do. They don't need to be provided with salaries, proper conditions, etc. It is enough to give them weapons and determine the direction of movement. The readiness of the population to die for some ideals of the North Korean dictator is many times higher than that of the Russians. So given this situation and challenges, he will try to involve North Korean troops in the Russian military. Moreover, historically, North Korea had a large number of specialists who served in the Soviet Union.
умовах війни. Населення таке собі, і пояснив чому. Тобто для них навіть 5-мільйонну армію поставити в стрій, це складно, але вони...
The North Korean dictator's father was a captain in the Soviet army. Therefore, this should be taken very seriously.
Їм достатньо дати зброю і визначити напрямок руху.
North Korean soldiers as a combat unit are, of course, so-so, but if the trend of interaction continues, it will become a serious threat. Putin went to Vietnam after North Korea for a reason.
Маючи такі виклики навіть перед собою, і він намагатиметься вливати північно-корейські війська в російські, чи пробувати їх готовити. Тим паче, що все-таки історично Північна Корея
Today, world politics is completely unstable, and what politicians say today may change tomorrow. So can dictators.
Не будемо вникати, але почнемо з того, що сам же ж батько північно-корейського диктатора це був капітан радянської армії в свій час. Так що потрібно до цього надзвичайно дуже серйозно віднестись. Так, північно-корейські солдати як бойова одиниця така собі, але це якщо зараз, якщо надалі ця тенденція в їхньої взаємодії піде, я думаю, що це буде серйозна загроза. Тим паче Путін не даремно свій час після Північної Кореї поїхав і в В'єтнам. Так його тому там дали відпір від коша і він поїхав. Але знову ж це зараз. Світова стабільність політики полягає в тому, що світова політика абсолютно нестабільна. І те, що політики говорять одне сьогодні, завтра може мінятися. Так само і диктатори.
First, Putin said he wanted to integrate Russia into NATO. Then he said that Crimea was Ukrainian. Then he said we would not attack Ukraine. And then he said we should create a sanitary zone out of Ukraine. So much for the answer to the question of how dictators keep their word, or how they can change completely different sides and vectors of their policies during their rule. They are not obliged to keep what they promise to their population because they are dictators. I wanted to ask how the world should react, the democratic countries that support us, against the background of dictators uniting. Blinken, by the way, spoke about this recently, and Stoltenberg emphasized it a few months ago. Now we see real examples of how this is happening, but there is still no adequate response. We can't wait, watching them make promises and not fulfill them. Everyone in the Western world of politics understands this perfectly well. Negotiating with them is a losing proposition in advance. The European policy of liberalism assumed that any person could be controlled if a certain package of social benefits was created. It turned out to be fundamentally wrong. It became erroneous, because we saw at the level of dictatorships that dictatorship is an idea, faith in the leader, not social benefits. European society has been shaped by generations, and now it is extremely difficult to change the vector of their perception. If European countries cut spending on the Ministry of Defense and military training, even though their technology is of high quality and advanced, it often turns out that they cannot even recruit a large number of people themselves. Lacking experience in large-scale general wars, European governments made society fear the law and limit their influence on the rights of others. Now, all the individualism, it's all good, it's all effective, but it works in a peaceful environment where there is no dark side, so to speak. Now they have to convince their society of the diametrically opposite. And it takes time. Politicians, as they say, every master is like his dog. Politicians have become like their society, and they serve society. European politicians serve their society and have become similar to it. It is difficult, if you profess liberal values, to switch to some national ones. You need to tell your society that you need to limit benefits, cut spending on social welfare, and say, on the development of the army.
Потрібно обмежити блага, потрібно скоротити видатки на соціалку, а скажімо, на розвиток нашої армії і багато інших нюансів. Тобто перебудовувати свою економіку.
We need to rebuild the economy, restore factories, and look for engineers, not technologists who should design rockets for space, but rockets for war. Now it is not futuristic objects that need to be designed, but military ones, and many other nuances. Thus, Europeans face two challenges: how to consolidate their society without harming it, and how to fulfill their obligations to support Ukraine. Hoping that something will go away is unlikely to succeed, because the war in Ukraine is a symptomatic pain in the body. If left untreated, it will surely lead to metastasis, infection, and death of the whole organism.
І якщо на нього не реагувати, обов'язково він призведе до метастаз, зараження і смерті цілого організму.
Now the European Union is trying to respond to this pain, but not with medicine, but with some kind of drugs. That's why there is minimal assistance to Ukraine, and an attempt to hope to see Putin's face or keep it as it was in the beginning. This is also flirting with their politicians, because for some reason, some European politicians, as well as American politicians, believe that if they have a personal relationship with Putin, he will definitely respect them or have the same feelings for them. And unfortunately, there are many other nuances, but in general, it affects this.
Але в цілому воно, власне, на це впливає. Хоча з іншої сторони, не зможеш, Європа теж перебудовується. Європа за скільки...
On the other hand, Europe is also rebuilding itself. In 2 years, or a year or two, it was able to jump off the Russian needle. But again, we did not. The war went on for a long time. As we can see, many European companies are circumventing sanctions under different flags and trading with Russia. We know that even at one time, Biden hinted somewhere to our top political leaders not to smash Russian oil refineries so sharply and quickly. And many other nuances indicate that Russian ports, whether in the Baltic, the Sea of Azov, or the Caspian Sea, are loading this oil and gas somewhere and transporting it. Where can they go if these seas, say, border European countries? There are a lot of nuances here. This is the global economy. But I will say this: the tougher we are in our judgments of the enemy, the more consolidated we are in the country, the more European politicians will look up to us. They will have a positive example for their populations, and they will work more effectively to support Ukraine, whether in terms of arms or financial support. But it all depends solely on us. No one will do our job for us.
На підтримку України, чи на підтримку зброї, чи в фінансовому плані. Але це все залежить сугубо конкретно від нас. Ніхто за нас не зробить нашу роботу.